Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Wen's World. It's always good to have fascinating guests from fascinating places doing fascinating things. And today's no exception. We have the good doctor right with us here in Wen's World, Dr. Fazal Rana. Dr. Fuzz, how are you?
Hey, Joey, it's great to catch up with you again. It's been a while.
It has. Dr. Fazal Rana was with us back in the old world of WENS, and now we're doing new things, new topics, exploring new issues, and none more relevant than COVID-19. We're going to talk a little bit today about the vaccination, all the questions, doubts, and concerns surrounding the vaccination process. But I want to back it up a little bit and talk about the organization that you represent so well. Reasons to Believe out in the great state of California. What are you guys doing out there at Reasons?
Yeah, well, our organization is a science faith think tank, if you will, where we look at the scientific case for God's existence and the reliability of the Old and the New Testaments. And so we're all about using science as a way to build a bridge to the Christian faith, and the Christian faith to build a bridge to science.
That's awesome stuff. And of course, they're no stranger to the interwebs and the social sphere. You can find them online at reasons.org. Is that correct still?
Yes, that's right. That's our website, reasons.org. We have a ton of resources that people can access that give them a sense of our flavor when it comes to approaching science faith issues.
Very cool. And I mentioned the social sphere, and of course, Twitter is the home of at RTB_official. And you can find Dr. Fazal Rana as well on Twitter at RTB_FRANA. Dr. Fuzz, you have a couple credentials, right? You've done school for a couple years. You have a couple degrees. Tell us a little bit about your background and how that lends credence and structure to your opinions.
Yeah. Well, I'm a biochemist by training, so I've got a PhD in biochemistry, and I also spent about a decade doing R&D in the private sector for a Fortune 500 company. And so I'm not a vaccinologist, I'm not a virologist, but I am a molecular life science and do have a pretty good understanding of the processes that would be involved in developing vaccines, and then also in assessing, their effectiveness and their safety.
And here we are in a brand new year, 2021. This time last year, we were ready to enter into the second phase of the roaring 20s, right? Everybody had their flapper gear on. We're geared up for a fantastic year. And then history taught us a very valuable lesson, to count our blessings, as it were. Living out in the state of California, you guys are in the heat of the kitchen, so to speak. What has life been like since last March out in California for you guys?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have gone through pretty much a continuous state of shutdown, where people have primarily been operating with a safe at home or safer at home set of orders. So primarily, essential people are been out and about, but pretty much everybody's been at home. Schools have been shut down for the most part. And right now we're seeing a surge, unlike anything we've seen up to this point, in the number of COVID-19 cases, to the point that hospitals are literally being overwhelmed, where the medical system in the state of California is about to implode. So it's a really dire situation here in California right now.
Yeah, I've heard nothing different than the way you just covered it. Thankfully, there is help on the way. Obviously, some financial help from our government, but more so this vaccine, right? We're looking at 2 vaccines, and this comes with no shortage of doubt, skepticism, and for some, a little bit of hope. But let's talk about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, what differentiates them from each other, and how these COVID vaccines are different from other vaccines we've seen as of late.
Yeah, well, both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are really a new type of vaccine, so to speak. They're called messenger RNA vaccines. And the way that they differ from traditional vaccines, which are basically made up of usually like an attenuated virus or a deactivated virus, where you're injecting viral particles into your body, and then your immune system responds to them, and that then affords you protection against that particular viral pathogen. And so most of the vaccines that we're familiar with are in that particular category. But in recent years, there's been a number of different approaches to vaccines that are being explored. And the Pfizer Moderna vaccines represent one of those next generation vaccines, where here, instead of injecting the virus either attenuated or deactivated, what you're doing is you are injecting essentially a synthetic piece of messenger RNA that is encapsulated in what's called a lipid nanoparticle. You can kind of think of it as a fat droplet that is in which the RNA is embedded, and that protects the RNA once it's injected into the bloodstream and helps that RNA get into the cell. And then once inside that cell, that little piece of RNA kind of has a set of instructions that tells the cell's machinery to make, in this case, the virus's spike protein. And so if you've seen a picture of the virus, it's like spherical with all those knobs sticking out. Well, those knobs are cleverly named spike proteins. And those are kind of like what binds to the surface of the host cell. And when it binds, that then triggers a set of events that allows the virus to enter the cell. So it's kind of like a lock and key. And so what you're doing is having the cells produce just that spike protein, not the whole virus, just the spike protein, that then gets presented to the immune system. And the immune system develops immunity to the spike protein. But since the virus is coated with the spike protein, we now have immunity to the virus. So it's a very clever and a very elegant system that has a number of advantages. One is that you don't have to handle viruses when you're producing the vaccine, nor are you introducing a virus into the patient. You are introducing, again, a synthetic piece of genetic code that is triggering the immune response.
You know, with a lot of vaccines that we see every year with the flu vaccine, it's usually like 65-35, if we're lucky, 70-30 in terms of effectiveness. How effective are these vaccines, both the Pfizer version and the Moderna vaccine, against the COVID-19 virus?
Well, all we can go on at this point is the phase 3 clinical studies. And those studies indicated that both vaccines were on the order of about 90% effective. That is absolutely astounding, as you said, when you compare it to something like the annual flu vaccine that we get. So all indications are that these vaccines are going to be highly effective at protecting people. I suspect that the level of protection will drop a little bit as we go from a well-defined clinical set of people to the population at large, but we're still looking at probably in the high 80s percent in terms of effectiveness, would be my guess.
You know, there's been a lot of talk about this virus evolving into a more deadly version. Is that going to affect the impact of either or both of these vaccinations?
Yeah, well, and just to be clear, this new variant of the virus that apparently originated in the UK that has everybody concerned is not more deadly in the sense that once you contract that virus, the progression of COVID-19 is more severe, but rather it's more deadly because it's more transmissible, which means it's much more likely that people will be infected with COVID-19 and therefore, suffer the ill effects. And just to give some context, there's been a statistic I saw about 90,000 isolates of COVID-19, the COVID-19 virus from patients that have had their genome sequenced, and 12,000 variants have been identified. So this is just one of 12,000 variants. So this is not unusual. Viruses mutate, but what makes this particular variant of concern is that 8 of the mutations are actually in the spike protein, which is what you're targeting with the vaccines. But as I looked at where those mutations were mapped onto the spike protein, there's really only one of them that would be of concern in terms of impacting the effectiveness of vaccines. And this is one of 20 places where antibodies would bind to the spike protein. And so you still would have about 19 potential antibody sites that are unaffected. So my suspicion is that the vaccine will be effective against this particular variant. though we do need to be concerned because it is, again, much more contagious.
You know, this operation has been called warp speed, which kind of creates some doubt and skepticism and a little bit of fear in the speed in which these vaccines were created. Is that understandable to you and the medical community at large? And how would you address that to somebody who's kind of teetering between getting the vaccine and not getting the vaccine?
Yeah, well, I'm highly sympathetic to the concern that these vaccines were developed very rapidly, because uh, prior to this, the fastest we've ever been able to develop a vaccine has been 4 years. And so this is, and initially I was very much concerned about that myself. Now, again, as I mentioned in the, when you introduced me, I'm a biochemist, not a vaccinologist. I don't study vaccines. So as I began to read about mRNA vaccines, my concern really evaporated to the point where I'm really confident in the safety and the effectiveness of these kind of vaccines. And yes, indeed, I mean, we're looking at record pace of vaccine development with these COVID-19 vaccines. But as I learned, our mRNA vaccines have been under development for 30 years. And so people have studied these vaccines, have studied how to make them effective, how to make them as safe as possible. And just before COVID-19 hit, there were already some human clinical trials with mRNA vaccines that were underway for other viral pathogens. And so we had such an understanding of mRNA vaccines that all we had to do when COVID-19 hit was take the spike, the genetic sequence, I'm sorry, for the spike protein, and then use that to build a tailor-made RNA for that virus spike protein, which meant that literally we went from days of having that gene sequence to already being in animal testing. And this is just simply endemic in the nature of how messenger RNA vaccines work. And so to me, it's almost eerie to think that we were already at the point of progressing messenger RNA vaccines into human clinical trials when COVID-19 hit. The stage was set, the table was set, and all we had to do was a little bit of tweaking, and voila, we had COVID-19 vaccines. So to me, that I see that as being, in effect, part of God's providential care for humanity, as not only a biochemist, but also as a Christian.
That's amazing insight. In case you're just joining us, we are with Reasons to Believe's own Dr. Fazal Rana. You can reach out to Reasons online, reasons.org. They're also on Twitter at RTB_official. Now, I want to talk a little bit, as I put on my tinfoil hat here, about the origins of this virus. There's a lot of hearsay about some Chinese Olympics, US soldiers bringing it there, the Chinese bringing it here, a little bit of perhaps political vendetta given the tariffs that Trump has imposed on China, the Communist Party there. What say you to some of the political implications, given how much this virus and the treatment of the virus has been politicized since its inception?
Yeah, well, I would probably lean towards the view that this virus was simply, what would be called a zoonotic transfer, where it originated in bats and then was transmitted to penguins, and then from there was introduced into the human population through the wet markets in China. So that would be probably where I would lean. But I don't think you can completely rule out the possibility that this particular virus was actually created in a laboratory and then accidentally released. I don't think it was engineered to be like a bioweapon. There's too many features of the virus that argue against that. But I do believe it's possible that this virus was actually isolated from nature and then genetically manipulated in the lab to study the virus in modes of transmission and things like that. And there was an accidental release. I don't think you can actually rule that possibility out, that it was a lab construct that was just created for research purposes that then was, again, released accidentally from the lab. Either way, I think China, and because of the communist enclosed nature of Chinese society, I think it's natural to have a lot of suspicion about what actually is going on and how forthright has the Chinese government been throughout this process.
Now, what are some of those factors that you mentioned that help you rule it out as not being a bioweapon of sorts?
Well, the genetic material of the virus basically shows, quote unquote, the scars of an evolutionary history. In other words, there are just simply features in there that would not be the types of features that you would introduce into a virus if it was a laboratory construct meant for a bioweapon. But there are some unusual features about the virus that does raise some suspicion. One of them is what's called a highly optimal, highly efficient furin cleavage site. So we were talking about the spike protein. And so when that spike protein binds to the cell surface receptor, there's another event that takes place where a protein in the host cell's surface will cleave portions of that spike protein, and that triggers what's called a fusogenic event, where the virus now becomes basically engulfed inside the cell. And that site of cleavage is an ideal site that you wouldn't typically expect to see in that just right location in a natural virus, a virus that was essentially originating in nature. It looks like somebody genetically engineered that site as a way to study the process or the mechanism of viral entry into the cell. So that's one feature that to me looks like it's highly suspicious in terms of, could this actually be maybe a lab construct? I mean, either way, we've got a pandemic that we're trying to deal with regardless of how it originates, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, we are where we are. It is what it is. But it also helps to kind of look back and learn lessons, valuable lessons about where we are politically, where we are socially, and how to engage with specific nations that perhaps don't have the world's best interest at heart, China being one of them, in my humble opinion. As people are battling with this virus, a lot of people have experienced side effects from trying to do the right thing, quote unquote, by getting these vaccinations, both the Pfizer one and the Moderna one. Can you speak to some of these side effects that have happened? Are these commonplace with vaccines? How do we get past this side effect issue so that a nation of people aren't sketch about getting these vaccinations?
Yeah, these are great questions, Joey, and very important questions. And it's important to keep in mind that the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, also this is true for the AstraZeneca vaccine in the UK, and Johnson and Johnson will be coming up with a vaccine here soon as well. These are all being granted emergency use, emergency approval for usage because we're in the midst of a pandemic. And so the regulatory agencies basically looked at the data from the clinical studies and said, these things seem to be highly effective. There's no obvious safety issues with these vaccines beyond what you would typically expect with a vaccine. Therefore, given that we're in the pandemic, there's no reason not to approve them for emergency use. So we don't really know anything about long-term safety or long-term effects of these vaccines, though there's nothing that I've seen to suggest that these things are going to have any kind of long-term safety effects. Now, the one point of concern would be for people that have autoimmune disorders or have highly allergic responses or strong allergic responses to things in the environment or medicines and things like that. Those are people that are going to likely be vulnerable to having severe side effects from the vaccine. The data now indicates that of about 2 million vaccination doses out there, there's been about 21 people, which is a very small number, that have gone into anaphylactic shock and had to require almost immediate hospitalization because of that. That's probably not unusual, and that's a relatively low number of people. So if you have an autoimmune disorder, or again, you tend to have strong allergic reactions to things, you probably want to be in close consultation with your physician before you receive that vaccine. But other than that, I've not seen anything that alarms me in terms of the safety of these vaccines. Two other groups of people that we have no safety data on would be pregnant women and mothers that are nursing, and then very small children. So these would also be two groups that I would be cautious about receiving vaccines unless you're in really close consultation with your physician, because we just don't have safety data on there. There's nothing to suggest that these wouldn't be safe, but we don't have the data to confirm that.
Couple follow-up questions. You made some really interesting points, Dr. Rana. Why is it, in your opinion, that when the virus first became first page news, that children were viewed as kind of a safer class to be out and about and not get and transmit the virus, but also to not be super spreaders?
Yeah, well, it does appear to be that children are, for whatever reason, much less vulnerable to the COVID-19 virus than adults. And I don't know that I have a good understanding why that is. I don't know if anybody has a good understanding why that is. Although we are, as the pandemic continues, we are getting more and more reports of children being actually affected by COVID-19. So it's not as if they're completely invulnerable, but statistically speaking, they are less likely to contract the virus, or if they do contract it, they're less likely to develop symptoms. And I don't know really why that is. There's a lot. This is the thing that I think is really concerning to the medical community, is there's so much that we don't know about the virus and its biological effects. There's so much that we really don't understand still about the progression of COVID-19 or the long-term effects of COVID-19, and so this is part of the reason why there's a real high level of concern about, again, making sure people are vaccinated, making sure that we're putting in place all these public health policies to try to prevent the spread of the virus, because we don't know a lot still about what the virus actually does to us.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think that there are a lot of people that have a ton more questions than answers. And one of the questions that a lot of people share, including myself, is with all of the deadly viruses out there, all of the viruses that are tremendously more contagious than COVID-19, why is it all of a sudden, in a time where we have a booming economy, the unemployment rate is lower than ever, it just seems like a perfect storm ahead of an election season, especially given the recovery rate for COVID-19 is so high, the death rate is so low compared to even something like the flu virus. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you do bring up a point that the timing when this COVID-19 pandemic hit could not have been at a worse time, because everything just seemed to be going so well. And it's easy, I think, to put on the, as you like to say, that tinfoil hat, and start seeing conspiracies. But in my opinion, a lot of the public health measures have been justified for two reasons. One is, well, for three reasons. One is we didn't really have a good understanding of what the biological effects were of this virus. This was a brand new virus. So there was absolutely zero immunity in the total global population, which meant that that the likelihood of spread was really high. There was absolutely nobody that was protected in the human population, and initially the death rate appeared to be much higher than it actually has turned out to be. And some of the reason why the death rate has dropped is because we have incredible men and women who work in the medical profession who have figured out how to treat people much more effectively with, that have COVID-19, particularly those really severe cases. So, we've benefited from some brutal lessons along the way to reduce the death rate. But even if the death rate is, let's say, 1% or 2%, when you have the possibility that 330 million people could be infected by it, you're now looking at a death toll in the millions. And again, here in Southern California, we're seeing the fact that our medical system is overwhelmed, and so even though we know how to treat this much better than we did when COVID-19 first hit, people are not going to be able to gain access to the benefits of that knowledge, because they may not very well get appropriate medical treatment. So part of the concern too is just, are we going to overwhelm the hospital systems? so to the point where we now are in basically an unimaginable situation where we are we have medical practitioners deciding that they cannot treat people that are coming into the hospital because their likelihood of survival is very low, and they can't afford to even try to save people who very well might have some chance of surviving whatever the medical ailment that they're experiencing.
You mentioned that this virus is one of a kind, but coronavirus is actually, there are quite a few of them, are there not?
There are, and some common colds are caused by coronaviruses. So there are other coronaviruses out there, but the symptoms that this coronavirus exerts are far more severe than other coronaviruses, and part of it has to do with where this particular virus binds. It binds to something known as ACE2 on cell surfaces, and this ACE2 protein is found in virtually every tissue in the human body. And so it really is not just really a respiratory virus, it really is a whole body virus. And so, people that get COVID-19 lose the ability to taste and to smell. For some people, it comes back quickly. Other people, it doesn't come back as quickly, which means that they are probably having long-term neuronal damage to their nervous system. There's some reports that people with COVID-19, have issues with memory loss and struggle with cognition. So there could be these long-term neurological effects that are part of COVID-19 that you wouldn't see necessarily with other coronaviruses. People that get COVID-19 also are susceptible to hyperclotting, which can lead to strokes and other heart diseases. And of course, we're familiar with the fact that without appropriate levels of oxygen, that can lead and trigger organ failure. So there's a lot of things that this virus does to our bodies that isn't done necessarily by other coronaviruses, which is another reason why, again, people are justifiably concerned, I think, about the spread of COVID-19.
So, Dr. Fuzz, you raised some really valid and great points about how this virus spreads, why it's deadlier than the other viruses. And there are a lot of people out there, and myself included to some degree, that have seen a lot of stories, even on the mainstream media outlets, about fraudulent numbers, whether they be the actual positive cases that are funding related. A lot of hospitals are getting extra money for extra positive COVID patients, COVID deaths, false positives with COVID tests, and even false negatives. Obviously, this virus isn't that old, so one could chalk it up to naivety, so to speak, or ignorance. But what say you about all of this?
Yeah, well, I can understand, some of those concerns, because to me it's been extremely frustrating, I think, to a lot of people, that we haven't had good, reliable testing to be able to determine if people do indeed have the SARS-2 coronavirus or not, right? And so that has been extremely frustrating, I think, for even people that are trying to make public health decisions. But there's other markers or other indications that that this is actually a real concern. One would be the number of hospitalizations that we see, due to the SARS-2 coronavirus, as well as the number of deaths that we see from it. So, for example, in the Los Angeles area, a lot of the hospitals were reporting number of admissions as well as number of deaths that followed those admissions, with people that had very clearly COVID-19 symptoms. And so again, that seems to indicate that this is actually a real thing. Although again, the number of people that have COVID-19 or have had COVID-19 in the population is really unknown. And this is, again, frustrating for everybody at hand. And so that would be another statistic that we could look at, would be, apart from the testing, would be what are the hospitalizations? Because that really, from a public health standpoint, is what is of greatest concern, because the hospitalizations indicate really significant issues, that again threaten to burden or overburden the healthcare system. You know, one of the things that also is a little bit concerning is that the average age for hospitalizations now is under 40 years of age. So this idea that that COVID-19 is only impacting people that are elderly or people that already have pre-existing conditions isn't necessarily true anymore. Because the virus is so widespread, we're actually seeing the average age for hospitalizations becoming younger and younger. And of those people that are hospitalized, the death rate is close to 2 to 3% of those people that are hospitalized that are in a younger category. 20% will be in intensive care, 10% will require going on ventilators. So this COVID-19 is serious business for everybody, not just for elderly people or people that have pre-existing medical conditions.
You know, when people are hospitalized, there are people that have to take care of them. You know, the nurses, the doctors, the staff, the techs, everybody at the hospital is conceivably at a tremendous risk. What say you about perhaps your own view on vaccination for you and your family? Are you a proponent of it? Are you a wait and see kind of guy? Where do you stand on that issue?
Yeah, well, it's everything that I know up to this point. I would, if I was offered the vaccine tomorrow, I would take it, right? And so I don't personally have any kind of, concerns about it. Now, my oldest daughter is pregnant, and so we've talked, and I think she's decided that she probably will not be vaccinated, not because she's an anti-vaxxer, but because we don't, again, have safety data on the effect of the vaccines on women that are pregnant or that are nursing. But also she's in a category where she's going to be one of the last groups to receive the vaccine just because of her age. And so by that point, she would probably already have given birth before, she would even be eligible for the vaccine. So I personally don't have any kind of qualms about taking the vaccine based on everything that I know today.
In your opinion, besides the healthcare workers that are taking care of these millions of people that are being afflicted, have been afflicted, and will be afflicted with this coronavirus, who are the next group of people, in your opinion, that should be vaccinated without question?
I think first responders, because they like healthcare workers are many times going into situations where they have no choice but to go into these very difficult situations where they cannot really make use of social distancing and other types of protective measures. So they are vulnerable people in that sense, and are serving us in the midst of this horrible pandemic. I would also say probably the next group would be elderly people in nursing homes, or people over, I don't know what age we might say, 70 years or 75 years of age. So we really want to try to save as many lives as we can. And I would say should go for the most vulnerable people. In California, a disproportionate number of people in African American communities and the Latino communities are being affected by COVID-19. So there's an argument that could be made that those communities maybe should be moved closer to the front of the line, again, in the interest of trying to save as many lives as possible. So to me, I think a common sense approach is the best way to go about distributing these vaccines.
Why do you think that minorities are being reported as some of the biggest targets for this virus, so to speak?
Well, I mean, this is a complex question, but part of it, at least in Southern California, is that these communities tend to be economically disadvantaged. They tend to be comprised of a greater number of essential workers who don't have the luxury of working at home. Housing is a premium in Southern California, so many of these families double and triple up, into homes, and so they are basically, again, socioeconomically disadvantaged communities that are high density communities that again have very little option economically other than to be out doing the work of essential workers, and so that probably at least contributes in part to why these communities seem to be so strongly affected. I'm very lucky because I can work from home, and I only go out when I want to go out. And so, I am afforded protection that, other people, in other communities in Southern California are not.
So, follow-up question to that, and thank you for all of this time. Again, if you're just joining us, we are with Reasons to Believe's own Dr. Fazal Rana, a brilliant man, biochemist. He's an author, he's a dad, he's a husband, he does it all. He wears many hats, and he also wears a mask. So, this next question is just one that people are thinking, but perhaps a little scared to ask. But why is it, given the risks, especially in minority communities, that we see visible gatherings of large amounts of people, and many of which aren't wearing a mask or a facial covering, or if they are, they only have their mouth covered and not their nose? If this is such a significant risk, why isn't it being viewed as such by the people that it's impacting the most?
Yeah, well, I think, there's a lot of, I think, misinformation about the severity of COVID-19. Again, where many people say, well, this is just like the flu. And unless I'm really old, or unless I have pre-existing health conditions, I'm safe. It's not going to be a big deal if I get COVID-19. And then sadly, people are horrifically mistaken as a result of that. That's, I think, part of it. Some of it has to do with the fact that, we as Americans don't like for people to tell us what we have to do. We're very individualistic, and so I think that's part of it. Unfortunately, I think that wearing a mask became politicized, where if you have certain party affiliations, you are skeptical about whether or not masks are necessary, that you see this as some kind of, political agenda on the part of people with a different political viewpoint. So I think all these things kind of come together, and contribute to that mindset. But, from my perspective, wearing a mask and wearing it properly is really a minor inconvenience, if at all. And if doing that affords me a little bit of protection, but affords other people that I'm going to be around protection as well, in case I actually have COVID-19 and I'm asymptomatic, to me, I think that's a really small price to pay just for the sake of protecting other people. So when I put my mask on, I'm not really thinking about my protection. I'm really thinking about the people I'm going to be interacting with. And to me, I think wearing a mask communicates to them, hey, I actually care about you, right? I don't want to see you sick, or to see you suffer in any way, shape, or form, or to potentially put your life at risk.
Oh, I'll be honest, I'm 100% with you, man. I mean, I didn't vote for Joe Biden, but I wear a mask everywhere I go, whether it's to the supermarket, to the gas station, to the gym. I may be the only person on the basketball court wearing a mask. And yeah, it's hard to breathe, but I also view it as one of those minor, insignificant things that I can do to not only protect other people, but to protect myself so that my family is protected. You know, what I don't want to do is spread that on and infect other people, whether, they live with me or don't. You talked about how Americans view individualism and liberty. What if mandatory vaccination is a consideration in the next year or two?
Yeah, again, I'm not, I'm very much in this instance, pro-vaccine here, but I would be a little uncomfortable with the idea of mandatory vaccinations. That just seems to be, to me, a little bit draconian, and maybe that again is the American in me speaking, where again I do believe individual liberty is very important. But I think I would be in favor of maybe if-then mandates. In other words, if you are a healthcare worker, then you must be vaccinated. If you are a first responder, then you must be vaccinated. If you're a teacher, you must be vaccinated. Or if you're going to travel on a plane, for example, you must be vaccinated. So I think if-then mandates make sense, because you can then at least say, look, if you don't have to be vaccinated, but if you want to take advantage of either certain job opportunities, or you want to have certain privileges or certain freedoms, within our society, you need to to be vaccinated in order to enjoy them, but it gives at least that person the right to object to receiving a vaccine and not having to be forced, to be vaccinated. I think the idea of mandatory vaccines is probably not going to happen, and I don't see it sitting very well with people if it does happen, even people that would be pro-vaccine.
So, what is it that you would love to see in the next year or so, given the situation we're in right now with this virus, the vaccine, a realistic scenario? Obviously, you'd like to see it eradicated completely, like everybody else listening to this. But what do you foresee from, the viewpoint of a scientist, as a biochemist, and based off all of your research, where do you think we're going to be in January of 2022 per se?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what we're going to see in the next year is probably companies like Johnson and Johnson and Janssen coming to the table with another option for us in terms of the types of vaccines that would be available. There may be other companies as well that will have vaccines that will be approved for an emergency use basis. I'm a little skeptical that we're going to be able to achieve vaccination targets in 2021. To me, it's not so much can we develop safe and effective vaccines. I think the answer is yes, we're going to be able to do that. And American consumers will have options as to which vaccine they would like to take. But I think the concern I'm going to have is primarily can we get the vaccine to places where we can deliver the vaccine to people that want the vaccine or need the vaccine. Unfortunately, the distribution of the vaccine is being left to local, state, and the federal government. And that, in my opinion, humbly speaking, those are the three worst organizations that you would want in charge of the vaccine distribution. And I understand why, from a pragmatic standpoint, that's necessary. But I just don't think we're going to see effect. I mean, we're already seeing, 70% of the available vaccines are not being administered to people because of distribution issues. If this is only going to get worse, we're going to see kind of the wild, wild west when it comes to vaccine distribution, I think, in the next year. I really hope that by the end of 2021, we'll have enough people vaccinated to see, herd immunity or begin to approach herd immunity. But I'm just really concerned right now about effective distribution of the vaccines.
Let's look a little bit further down the line. And then I want to talk about this brand new project that you guys are doing at Reasons. It's kind of its own thing. It's called Agree to Argue. And I love the title of that. So I want to talk about that. But before we get to that, I want to talk about something that you brought up, which is very interesting. The contrast between rights and privileges, right? So if you wanted to be a healthcare worker, you would need to get the vaccine. If you wanted to ride on an airplane, you need the vaccine. That is two starkly different day-to-day goings-ons, as it were. One requires a bunch of school and sacrifice, and the other just requires a few $100 and a suitcase or just a carry-on bag. Do you think that we'll get to the point here in America, and I'm not going to speak for the world at large, that the vaccine will become such a dividing issue that we will see companies underground on the black market, perhaps on the dark web, that sell bogus certification of vaccinations?
I never thought about that. Where your mind goes, Joey.
That's what we do.
But I could actually see that. I mean, you are hearing people talking about having, a vaccine certificate as being kind of like a passport. And when that happens, you could easily see there being underground operations that would actually give people that certification, even if they haven't been vaccinated. And so, to me, I don't know what you would do to avoid that, but I could see that as a very real reality. But, to me, I even like with the idea of, hey, if you want to travel by air, that you need to be vaccinated. To me, that's a common sense thing, because you do have, the pilots and the stewardesses, that are forced to be in a closed space environment with hundreds of people on flights, sometimes for long periods of time. And unless you can be confident that those people don't have COVID-19, you really are putting those employees in a vulnerable position, as well as everybody else who's on that plane. and plus as you're going from place to place, you do have that potential where, you are spreading the virus, beyond your local community. So, to me, it may seem draconian on one hand, but on the other hand, when you think it through, I think it makes sense. But
Do you ever foresee a scenario in a biblical context where something like this happens and it does trigger uh, biblically related events spoken of in the books of Jude, the book of Revelation? What does your gut tell you about that kind of thing?
yeah, well, I'm not quite sure that I've given enough thought to how something like a pandemic would connect with, the prophetic books, that we have in scripture, like, the book of Revelation. So I've not given it enough thought to really give you an informed or a thoughtful answer on that. But in many respects, you could say that we really did dodge a huge bullet with COVID-19. As bad as it is, if something this infectious but was deadly as Ebola broke loose, we would really be looking at a catastrophe of biblical proportions that I think would have people really turning, to the book of Revelation. So we really did, in many respects, dodge a huge bullet with COVID-19 in the sense that of all the viruses that could be unleashed as a pandemic, this one is far more benign than others that we could envision, like again, Ebola.
Do you think that this could perhaps be the first testing ground, so to speak, for powers that be, whether known or unknown, spiritual or physical, for future operations in terms of the experiment that was COVID-19? That we've seen how we react as a nation, as a people, as a partisan country. I mean, we're looking at it right now, given the recent events, the election, the accusations of this and that and this and that. Do you think that it's possible that we could see many more, much more deadly pandemics? And do you think it's a realistic scenario? Or do you think that this has more than anything opened up our eyes and prepared us for a possibility of like a bio war, so to speak?
Yeah, well, the concern, first of all, of bioterrorism is very real. And that we have increasingly powerful techniques available to us to genetically engineer viruses or other pathogens that could be unleashed, that could cause havoc that's far worse than what we've seen with COVID-19. So to me, in the back of my mind, and I think in the back of a lot of people's minds, is the real concern of bioterrorism, and even the fact that the prospects that COVID-19 might have been, again, a laboratory construct is very real, and is an idea that has been seriously entertained by people. Could this again be something that China was doing to try to disrupt the world economy? That isn't completely a ludicrous or outlandish, scenario to entertain, because of the technology that we have. And as time goes on, that technical capability is going to become even more and more sophisticated and more accessible and easy to use and low enough in cost that, again, a well-funded, malevolent actor could do quite a bit of damage. So I am actually very much concerned about that. On the other hand, I think the advance that we're seeing with messenger RNA vaccines is really significant, because I've heard people argue that these are the ideal vaccine, and that now that we've got messenger RNA vaccines in play, and we're going to learn a lot about how these vaccines perform, it does open up the possibility that if somebody did unleash something like a bioweapons attack, like we're talking about, that you could very quickly mount an effective countermeasure with the technology that exists, for example, in messenger RNA vaccines. Because again, it was incredible to think that within days we went from having the sequence of the spike protein to having a workable prototype for an RNA vaccine. And so that means that the countermeasures are going to also be available as well to combat these things. But we're living in a brave new world, and these are realities that are really upon us, whether we like it or not.
Man, this has just been awesome. I teased it. Now I want to deliver. Let's talk about this brand new project available on YouTube. It's called Agree to Argue. We've always heard the line, let's just agree to disagree, right? And leave it there. But I think that's a weak stance to have. I think that there's something to having a diplomatic and chivalrous conversation with people that we just perhaps disagree with on some things. I love that you're bringing it back. Go into a little bit the context and how you're doing it and how we can watch it from time to time.
Yeah, well, we've launched a new show called Agree to Argue, and you can watch it on our YouTube channel. Agree to Argue is the YouTube channel. And we also have @Agree to Argue. So if you're curious about checking us out on social media, you can. But I'm one of the co-hosts on the show. I represent kind of a Christian theist position. And then we have a friend of mine, Steve McCrae, who's a YouTube personality in his own right, who is a non-theist. And we agree to come together once a month and argue as friends about some very significant and serious topics. On January 13th, we're going to go live at 3 p.m. Pacific time, and we're going to be taking on the question of how could a loving God send people to hell for all eternity, where we're going to be taking on that issue where he and I will be going back and forth. And we're beginning to bring guests onto the program who represent either one perspective or the other, who also have actual expertise in some of these questions. So it's a fun environment where we invite people to join the conversation through the chat feature on YouTube, where we take questions from people watching live. So it's a lot of fun. It gets intense at times, as you can imagine, but the hope is really that we kind of foster an attitude that, look, we can be friends even if we don't see things eye to eye, and that we can love and respect one another and really be concerned about the best interest of others. And that by debating these difficult issues, we hopefully shed light on the topic as opposed to just simply, obfuscate things. And we live in a world that's so polarized, and if we can do anything to break down that polarization, then I think, we need to do that. And one of those things is, promoting the art of civil conversation and civil discourse.
Man, I think you should run for office. I'd vote for you. You're too smart for that, though. You know better. Well, I'm
I can only be
excited.
president for a day, right?
Right. You would just tell it how it is and people would get offended and start booing you. But hey, I'd hold up your sign, Dr. Fuzz. I can't wait to watch this. Coming up real soon on the 13th at 6 o'clock on the East Coast, 3 o'clock on the West Coast. Agree to Argue is the name of the channel. But I'm excited to watch this and perhaps weigh in on this discussion of, can a loving God, or should a loving God, or will a loving God send people to a place he created specifically for fallen angels? That's a really interesting question. I'm excited to watch that and maybe weigh in.
Yeah. Well, you're invited.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to have you here in Wen's World. You're amazing, Dr. Fuzz. Thank you so much for your time today. And I look forward to doing this again real soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joey. And it's great to see you again.
You too. Thank you again.